In the darkest shadows, in the white cold, fearlessly we search for knowledge new and old. We drink the strong spirits and read ancient tomes, the order of the Abercast. We are the brave and bold. Oh, it's the same windstorm. It's just carried over.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar.
Stigmata Studios presents The Jin Jihad. The Jin Jihad kicks your face with myths, mysteries, epic battles, suicide bombers, quirky characters, and divine power armor. In this epic graphic novel, the warrior archangels descend on a city in chaos. It's all-out war. The non-standard assembly battles an ancient terrorist organization and their ultimate weapon, a corrupted, magically enhanced, unstoppable monster, the Jinn. This graphic novel is a wild ride. It's one part distant Arab myth, one part Old Testament angelic vengeance, and one part unique heroic tough guys. Available on Amazon. Get more info on the Jin Jihad and other titles at stigmatastudios.com.
The Abercast. Occult. History. Conspiracy. Violence.
All right, welcome to the Abercast. Your home slice, John Towers. Welcome to, I already said welcome to the Abercast. Okay, so welcome to the Abercast again. Let's see, check out the I should stop saying that. Check out the website, stigmatastudios.com. Who fucks with this when I'm not in this room? You go to the bottom, find my social media links, hit me up. I have been messing around with the transcriptions of the show. It's taken me quite a long time to figure out how to obtain the transcriptions of the show without paying for them. So I've been playing around with them, and right now the only besides them being wildly inaccurate, hard to read because of the missing punctuations and them not understanding a lot of the words I say, like Harpocrates. It's still fun to go through. They're fun to go through. So I was going to put them on a blog, and I was just like, fuck all that. Who's got time to do all this shit? So I've been throwing them in. I've done a handful of them. And I started throwing them into the Facebook page, not my personal page. I've been putting it in the Stigmata Studios page. So it's the Stigmata Studios page. It's all one word, Stigmata Studios page. If you're interested in them, and then when you get down to the bottom, it actually has a link You can play the shows right there. If you're like, what the fuck is he talking about? You can just forward to that part, I guess, or whatever. Anyhow, it's just funny. I've been messing around with it. The people who are like, Google's AI is going to take over the world. I'm like, I don't know. I don't think so. Not yet, anyway. I think we still have a little ways before the Google AI can take over the world, just based on how it transcribes my show. Also, I never realized how much I stutter. Apparently, I stutter a lot. So that's interesting for me. Something for me to work on. You know, nobody's perfect, and it's important to have goals. My goal is to stop doing these little coughs in the middle of the show, and apparently to stop stuttering. So there's all that. Website, Patreon. I have a Patreon account. I'm waiting to get it going. The main goal right now for the Patreon, look, I got a studio already. It's all set up. It's ready to go. So I want for nothing. However, I do have a dream about getting this Books for Soldiers program up off the ground. And I have a measly goal set up for that. It's basically just to pay for shipping, for organizing it. So the idea would be I would find some soldier. I'm linked up with two of these groups that do this, send media to soldiers overseas. And that was a real cough, by the way. That wasn't a stalling for time, nervous cough. I've been podcasting now for like 11 years, and for some reason, whenever I'm reading stuff, I still have this little cough I got to deal with. Anyhow, so I'm hooked up with these two organizations that send media to soldiers overseas. I tried to do it. I mean, if you listen back to the show, I'm sure you could probably find me referencing this because I wanted to do it for a Christmas project for all of us to do. However, I could never figure it out, and I didn't want everyone sending books to my house. I wrote a book called The Djinn Jihad. I don't want to just put my address out there. However, I know it's easy to find if people are so inclined, so whatever. That's why I have firearms. But, so really the business end of the Patreon right now is to give out, I want also a reason to get these Abercast mason jars with the oath printed on them. So this is a great opportunity to make both of those things happen. So if you guys are interested in helping out some soldiers overseas that need stuff, we can't send in pornography. And I want to get like something together about the Patreons and stuff to send to them, you know, if it ever winds up happening. So anyhow, I'm not beating this fucking thing to death. However, it does link in with this, this week's episode. So got the transcriptions, got the Patreon Books for Soldiers thing. Website, iTunes. I'd like to, encourage everyone to rate and review the show on iTunes. It helps, supposedly, it helps get eyeballs on it, and it's not like an ego thing. It's hey, help me grow the show, and it literally costs you nothing. I've been looking at the sources. Since I joined Spreaker, I get an insane amount of data from on who's listening to the show, and I could tell most people get the show from iTunes. So I'm just saying, hey, if you're getting the show from iTunes, you're already on iTunes. Just swing by, leave me a rating. I got a couple new ratings. And I got some reviews. I love the ratings, but I also love the reviews. I'm sitting pretty right now at 4.5 stars. But I got some ratings, so as promised, I will read them out. An interesting podcast, and well, be careful. 5 stars by Indie Film Wisconsin. He says, on a lark, I started to hear the shows, and the more I heard, the more I thought I needed to hear more, and now I fear the MIB riding Mothman. Was this review helpful? Fuck, yeah, it was helpful. You're welcome for your feedback. The next one is a guy by the name of Sean Hayes. 5 stars. His review is called Be Warned. It says, this show is like crack. You try it once, and the next thing you know, you're behind a dumpster doing things you are not proud of to get another fix. Was this review helpful? Yes, it was. Thank you very much, Sean Hayes. So I encourage you guys to please rate and review the show on iTunes. I have a very small amount of rate and reviews. I would love to pump it up. For as much as I bitch and whine and complain about it, that's actually when I did the Lesser Key of Solomon books in the I think it was the 3rd episode, when I actually did the whole ritual. I actually asked the demon I summoned to get me some rate and review. So maybe that's just finally paying off. You know what I'm saying? Maybe it's finally paying off. So this week, I know I'm babbling a lot. We got a lot of shit to get through. I thought that I would take this opportunity to actually do a Memorial Day episode. And we're going to wind up talking about one of the bloodiest battles in the history of the world. And we're going to get into some numbers, and we're actually going to talk about at least one of the key players involved and all of this kind of business. We're not going to get, I know that I have like this thing where I need to put stuff into context. Like when I did the Battle of 73 Easting, I actually started talking about the Carter Doctrine and what we were actually doing in Iraq in the first place, or why we decided we need to go. And I know when I talk about all of these things, all of these battles, I try to couch it in some context so we can understand it better. However, this is going to be a massive episode, and I don't really want to talk about the whole of the Great War. You know, this episode is more about the British soldiers who fought, specifically the British and, the French soldiers who fought and were wounded and died in the Battle of the Somme. And also why they fought and why they died and why they left so much English blood on that field. We want to talk and we want to appreciate that and understand their sacrifice and tell their story of 102 years ago. So, the World War I does get a little bit of flack, especially from conspiracy folks that are like, it was royal family von Habsburg's bitch slap fight or whatever. And you can believe that. I mean, if you're listening to the show and you believe that, you believe, it was about, whatever. That's one of the reasons I'm not putting it into context, is because no matter what it's about, we're actually talking about the sacrifice of the men of the British Expeditionary Force. And whether you think that sacrifice was silly or not, or whether you think it was warranted or not, or whether you think it was them just throwing their lives away or not, the fact is that they did it. And at the end of the day, we're going to see that, they did not share your feeling, if you feel that way about it. They did not share that. To them, they were sacrificing and stuff for a lot of real reasons, and we're going to get into all of that. So I'm not admonishing my brethren that, think that, there's a lot of reasons to, think all of that stuff, but that's not what we're talking about. Like I said, I'm specifically not putting it into context just so we could talk about this fight and the British, specifically soldiers who fought and got wounded and died and left their British expeditionary fucking blood all over the place. So let's just get into this. Before I go any further, I'd like to suggest to everybody to go and find a mason jar. It could be dirty. It's fine. Your mason jar could be dirty, baby. You know what I'm saying? I want you to fill it up with ice cubes. Not ice cube. Ice cubes. And get a slice of lime. If you're in a pinch, you don't have any lime, you can put lemon in there. If you don't have any lemon, you can Get some lemon-scented Pledge out of your cleaning cupboard and just spray it right in there. Actually, please don't do that. That was a joke. But, put it in there, spray it in there. Don't. I'm just saying don't do it. But I'm saying go ahead and just spray it in there. And then put 2 shots of the shittiest gin. Or, like, if you don't have any shitty gin, maybe some turpentine. That might do the trick. Or some engine cleaner. You could throw some cheap, engine cleaner in there. And then just fill the rest up with tonic water. And if you're like me, you have some chopsticks laying around, just stir it up with a chopstick. If you don't have a chopstick, you can use, like, a screwdriver. Or, like, a knife. The tip of a lightsaber. I don't know. Stir it up somehow. And there you go, everybody. That's your gin jihad. It's not really a drink recipe, more of like a formula for a weapon of mass distraction. I got mine right here. If you join the appropriate tier on Patreon pretty soon, we're all going to have some sweet ass Abercast mason jars with the fucking oath printed right on them. That's all that I'm saying. I'm not beating you over the head with it. I'm just saying, think about how fucking cool that will be. It's gonna be cool. Here's the swimming with bow-legged women. Now that that's all under control, we can move forward. Oh, maybe I should mention this. I don't know. Since it is Memorial Day weekend. Yeah, I can mention it because it's going to be over. This isn't going to post until Monday. I'm recording a little bit early. If you are, participating in the Solo A Star Wars Story boycott, here's to you, my friends. I don't call for boycotts and I don't support them openly, except for just this one time. Like, we gotta really just fucking teach this Kathleen Kennedy what's going on. And, like, fix our fucking Star Wars already, will you? Fix it. Enough with all this bullshit. It's the last time I'm gonna mention Star Wars in this episode. So, 1916, Europe is in a grip of World War I. They called it the Great War. Historians frequently call this the first modern war. Technology brought us to the point of where mass destruction is possible. Just think about it. Decades before World War I, armies were still like lining up like the fucking Revolutionary War with their bright colored jackets and their fucking muskets. Just decades before World War I, this was still happening in some parts of the world. World War I ushered in the era of destructive technology. It ushered in the era of the machine gun. World War I's the first time we used tanks. Actually, this battle is one of the first times they used tanks. We're going to get into it. I love tanks. Hey, everybody, I heart tanks. The Somme is this meandering river on the Western Front. The Allies, who are, at this time, the French and the British, are locked up with the massive German army along 450 miles of trenches. And this is no man's land, the trenches. There's barbed wire, machine guns, and artillery made crossing no man's land impossible. Actually, no man's land is what's called the open ground between the two lines, the Allied trenches and the German trenches. It's called no man's land, and this was really, if there was a shitty part of that Wonder Woman movie, it is this, because it kind of does take away from the what really happened at the battle of the Somme. So, in the first months of the war, parts of France and Belgium were occupied by the Germans. and France was taking a beating. So for help reading this, or for help getting through this topic, I found this a student report from the Air Command and Staff College. It was a student report, Douglas Haig in the Battle of the Somme by Major Harold M. Jensen, Jr. This was done in 1984. You can find this online, and this guy, Major Harold Jensen Jr., really does a great job summarizing and breaking down this battle. Now, this report had to do with more than just this battle, but I excised the parts that have to do with this battle, so I can refer back to it when we're getting into this stuff, which I'm going to do right now. So, France was taking a beating, and I'm going to refer now to the Air Command and Staff College student report on Douglas Haig and the Battle of the Somme. Here we go. This is section 3, called Strategy and Tactics, in part. The first major battle of the British Expeditionary Force under its new commander was to be the Battle of the Somme, the bloodiest battle of World War I. Why did Haig attack on July 1st, 1916? Some have argued that it was too soon. He should have waited for a large number of tanks and more personnel, or attacked somewhere else. Others ask what led him to use the strategy exhibited at the Somme. As early as 24 November 1914, Haig remarked to the king, quote, "The surest way to prevent the enemy from attempting to invade Great Britain is to engage and press him hard on the continent," unquote. Now, this guy, Haig, is a contemporary of Churchill at the time. Now, Churchill was a politician, where Haig was, I believe at this time he was a general. I believe he was a general staff officer. Nearly everyone encouraged Haig to do this. In July of so definitely he was general. In July of 1915, he, as a representative from General Joffre's headquarters, told Haig the French people were tired of the war and the economy was practically at a standstill, and there was a general wish to end the war that autumn with a strong effort. A month later, the Secretary of War advised Haig that the British forces would do their best to support the French, even if it meant suffering heavy losses. I think I'm going to be referring to this over and over again in different ways in different sides of this report. The British and the French, even though they were adversaries, they had an adversarial relationship for a long time. At this time, they are, they're like, like when you have a cousin and you fight your cousin all the time. You're like, but at the end, you're like, I still love my cousin. Like, this is kind of the kind of relationship France and Britain has. As the newly installed British Expeditionary Force commander, Haig sent for the French liaison officer and pointed out that while he was not under General Joffre's orders, his intentions were to, quote, to carry out General Joffre's wishes on this. I'm sorry if you guys can hear this cat going crazy in the background. I don't know. She's usually not the cry at the back door kind of cat. I don't know what she's doing. Strategical matters, as if they were orders. 3 weeks earlier, the Allies had decided on a simultaneous offensive sometime in the middle of 1916. So before France and England could get their shit together, Germany attacks Verdun, which is the French fortress city, and all the French reserves were called to Verdun. And that wound up leaving the British to lead and to plan this this joint attack, this joint summer offensive. They needed to put pressure on the Western Front to relieve the pressure of the French on Verdun. So the idea is they're not really, like, Haig is, we're going to get into this a little bit later, but Haig is like, I need to relieve the pressure for the reserve for the French army so they could get a little bit of relief. It's like, I need to punch. It's like a punch counter punch. Like, I need to really fucking sock it to the Germans over here so they can pay attention to me rather than what's going on over there at Verdun. Back to this report. By May 1916, the situation at Verdun was serious. Haig noted in his diary that the French losses would probably reach 200,000 by the end of the month. And, quote, if this went on, the French army would be ruined, unquote. At a meeting of the British and French staffs, Haig remarked that before fixing the date for the Somme offensive, he wanted to compare British Army readiness on the 1st and 15th of July and the 1st and 15th of August. Yeah, come here. Everything's okay. Just relax. You can be with me. It's cool. Just hunker down. Sorry, this is the first time my cat's ever interfered in the podcast. I don't know what's going on. They usually just sit around and look at me. He remembered, quote, that moment I mentioned August 15th, Joffre at once got very excited and shouted, the French army would cease to exist if we did nothing until then. Haig agreed to 1 July. Britain's other allies were not doing well either. Blah, 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 blah. The Italians had also appealed to Russia for help, and in 4 June, response to Alexei Brusilov launched a surprise attack along the 300-mile front that was successfully slashed through the Austro-German line until checked by German counteroffensive on 16 June. It's difficult to quantify Russian losses at this point, but when the Brusilov offensive ended in September, the Russians had sustained about 1 million casualties. Jesus Christ. The war had deeply hurt all the allies except Britain. In England, the war was still very popular, and pacifists and conscientious objectors were treated as outcasts. Britain believed she could save the French and win the war. Now, it's important because this is something that Haig doesn't necessarily repeat, at least not in this report, but this is something that you could see in his actions. He's not saying Britain can jump in here and win the war. He's saying Britain believes she could save the French and win the war. It's an important distinction, I believe. So Haig would rather not attack at the Somme, and it had been pretty quiet there, allowing the Germans to really dig in and get their shit together. They had multiple defensive lines and were dug the fuck in. So each of these lines actually had 3 trenches. There were fire, support. There was a fire, the trench with the fire guys. Then behind them was the support dudes. This is this is like the logistics. This is where the supplies and the food and all this stuff might have been. And then behind them were the reserves. And crisscrossing laterally through them were communication trenches. So they can communicate between the different lines. We're going to get into this a lot later. But one of the advantages that the Germans had in these trenches, because they had time to dig their shit in, is they could run telephone lines. And they could like hardwire them into the trenches. So the reason even though that Haig was like, I would rather not attack at the Somme, the reason that he did have to do this is because this is where the British and the French armies met on the front. The battle starts with a week-long artillery bombardment on the German lines. So they had 1,400 guns, and the objective was to kill troopers, cut communication lines, and of course psychological warfare. Now, I don't think that they went into this with psychological warfare, but the term shell shocked came from World War One. They call, nowadays we don't call it that. They call it, PTSD, and they have all these other names for it and everything throughout the years, but it started as shell shock. During that week-long artillery bombardment, the British and French fired 1.6 million shells at these Germans. So let's talk about the trenches again real quick. I talked about the three trenches on each line: the fire line, the support line, and the reserve line. And with the communications trenches running laterally through them. So on top of this, what you have is you have barbed wire and you have cover, and as well as this ability to harden the communication line. So you have they use these things even up until when I was in the Army. They actually had landline telephones that we would stretch through. And you have the little crank on the side, zzz, and it would ring, whatever phone it was attached to, so you could pick it up and talk. This is before we had radios and stuff, and I'm going to get into the communications aspect of this battle later on. It's just important right now what I'm setting up is that you understand that the way that these guys communicated was with these telephone lines stretched through. So when I say that there were 1.6 million shells fired by 1,400 guns, and their goal was to kill troopers and cut communication lines, that's what they were doing. These weren't gigantic bullets flying. They would explode before they hit the ground, and they would they're supposed to have slashed through wire. If there were any landmines in there, they were supposed to blast the landmines. They were cutting through the barbed wire, I should say, and also through this communication wire that they have stretched through these trenches. Because the Germans had time to harden them, it actually becomes a problem later on. We're about to get into it. They also sent a bunch of combat engineers to dig mines under 19 strong points along the Western Front, and they filled these mines with explosives. So the plan is to blow them as soon as the push was coming across from the French and British lines through the German lines. As soon as the artillery stopped and the guys got up to push through, these 19 mines would start going. These 19 mines and these strong points would start going off. So also I should back up and say combat engineer. If you've never heard me talk about combat engineers before, buckle up, son. Buckle up. Because the combat engineer is a force multiplier on the battlefield. When I was in the service, I was a United States combat engineer. They're called sappers. The reason they're called sappers is when in medieval times, when castles and walls towns would come under siege, they had a specialized group of. They were like warrior craftsmen. They were like warrior skill craft. And what they would do is they would dig. They would figure out how to get through the masonry. They would sap the strength of these walls. So, it just turned and morphed into this thing. If you ever are watching a movie where a guy's dealing with a landmine, I mean, that guy could be EOD, which is, explosive disposal. But the chances are that guy came from a combat engineer unit. They train these guys to run through landmine fields with satchel charges of C4. and building line mains while people are shooting at them and stringing bang. If you ever hear in a movie like Saving Private Ryan, someone call for a Bangalore torpedo, like that's a combat engineer function, to run up there with a Bangalore torpedo while people are shooting at you. So the idea is that these engineers they provide. We're also later on, we're going to talk a lot about mobility and counter mobility, and these guys are the guys that do that. We're going to talk a lot about barbed wire later and obstacles on the battlefield, and these combat engineers are the guy that they are the dudes that design and implement how people move on the battlefield and where you go to die. You know, in Iron Man 2, when Rhodey and Iron Man are sitting there talking, and they're like, Rhodey's like, you can't stay down here. This is the kill box. It's what he's doing is he's looking, and he's like, you're in the low ground. Everybody is above you. Like, you can't stay here. This is a kill box. That's a combat engineer talking. I mean, in Rhodey's case, it's a combat aviator. But that's a combat engineer thing to do. Like, this is going to be the kill box. We're going to funnel them all here, and this is going to be the kill box. So, where the fuck am I at in my notes here? The night before the offensive starts, rumors start circulating among the Brits that the bombardment didn't work. I was actually able to find where that rumor came from. Hold on for 1 second. How long is it going to take me to find this before I sound like an a-hole? All right. So back to this report. And again, I just want to shout out. There's no links to this, so I'm not going to be able to put it. Well, maybe I will. Air Command and Staff College Student Report by Major Harold M. Jensen, Jr., 1984. 1984 was a great year for movies, by the way. All right, so there's rumors that start circulating among the Brits about how this week-long bombardment didn't work. Reports from the Allied night raiding parties and photo reconnaissance concerning results of the bombardment were both good and bad. They were generally good on the right flank, where the French heavy guns were causing considerable damage to the wire, trenches, and even some of the dugouts. On the left and in the center, there were smaller numbers of British heavy artillery. Their effect were further reduced when 1/3 of the shells failed to actually explode. In addition, the smaller British guns tasked with destroying wire primarily used a shrapnel charge. It was difficult to cut the wire with this kind of charge, and the infantry would find great stretches of wire still intact on the 1st of July. So we can see these British guys are going to have a problem. So if you think about the battlefield, maybe I'll post up a map or two to the Instagram. If you guys want to find the Instagram, you could get a better picture of what I'm talking about. They split the battlefield at the Somme. So the Somme runs perpendicular to the front, making an X, like if you or making a cross. It's actually, if you think about how much is north and how much is south, it's actually making like an upside down cross. So the French are on the southernmost side of the Western Front, and the British are on the vastly northernmost side of the Western Front. And what they're saying is that the British guns, for whatever reason, they were smaller, they were using the wrong artillery, they had less experienced artillerymen, so they estimated up to 1/3 of the shells were undetonated, which actually causes a problem with the advance just right off the bat. You never want to accidentally step on, disturb, look at an unexploded piece of ordnance. It's major problems right there. Major. Oh, hey, the AC came on. Hold on. Okay, so 7:30 a.m. the daylight, so the artillery commanders can see their targets. We're going to get into that a little bit later as well. British morale was high going into this thing. Back to this report. Thus, it was obvious the advice of the British Expeditionary Force Commander-in-Chief valued most highly, and the pressure he felt most strongly urged an attack on the Somme in 1 July 1916. To fully appreciate Haig's actions on the Somme, it was necessary to trace the development of his strategic and tactical ideas. In Haig's background, there are keys to his thoughts on war and his battlefield strategy, the future of horse cavalry, the employment of artillery, and the importance of new technology like machine guns and tank, and finally his attitude as a commander. While chief of staff in India before the war, Haig had identified Britain's primary threat. He said he instituted a close study of the German army and compared its differences between the organization adopted by the Germans and the prevailing in Great Britain and in India. He sought to arrive at a definitive decision between the alternative armies, between envelopment of the flank and penetration to the center. Above all, he strove to teach that no stereotyped system of strategy would be accepted as invariably the best, or indeed the only solution, that the ever-varying problem which would be presented in the course of modern warfare. He taught on each one of his staff tours that war would go through 4 phases. Remember these. There's going to be a quiz at the end. The 4 phases of Haig's victory. Or I should say war. The 4 stages of Haig's war. Maneuver for position. First clash of battle. This one's the important one. A wearing out fighting of varying duration. And eventually a decisive blow which would provide victory. At a dinner in July 30th, 1915, Halladine asked Haig how to win the war, and Haig responded, I wish I could do a British voice. By applying the old principles and the present conditions, engage the enemy in a wide... I'm sorry, I'm just taking away from the actual importance that this guy's talking about. He said, by applying the old principles to the present conditions, engage the enemy on a wide front. The wider, the better. 100 miles or more. Now, in retrospect, he got over 140 miles on his front. Then, after 5 or 6 days, bring up a strong reserve of all armies, attack by surprise, and break through where the enemy had shown that he was weak. It must be our objective to engage the enemy all along this line, so as to oblige him to use up his reserves. That's super important. Shortly after Haig took command of the British Expeditionary Force, he noted in his diary that the British action should take the form of 1. Quote, winter sports, unquote, or raids continued into spring, i.e. capturing lengths of the enemy's trenches at favorable points. 2, wearing out, fight similar to 1, but on a larger scale. Along the whole front will last about 3 weeks to draw in the enemy's reserve. This is a gross miscalculation on his part. 3, decisive attack to several points, object to break through. The amount of ammunition for 2 and 3 will be very large indeed. That part is right. Not all of Haig's prophecies were accurate, having been part of the cavalry for so long, he may have been blinded to its future war potential. He says, we're talking about Haig. Haig says, the role of the cavalry on the battlefield will always go on increasing because, 1, the extended nature of modern battlefield means that there will be a greater choice of cover to favor and conceal the approach of the cavalry. 2. The increased range and killing power of modern guns and the greater length of time during which battles will last will augment the moral exhaustion. It will affect men's nerves more. Look, he's predicting shell shock, basically, and producing greater demoralization among the troops. These factors contribute to provoke panic and to render troops, short service soldiers nowadays, ripe for attack by the cavalry. Longer the range and killing power of modern arms, the more important will rapidity and movement become, because it lessens the relative time and exposure to danger in favor of the cavalry. 4. The introduction of the small bore rifle, the bullet from which has little stopping power against a horse. Even as late as 1916, Haig was a strong supporter of horse cavalry. The King in 7 June conversation with Haig suggests a reduction in horse cavalry because of its maintenance cost. And Haig responded saying, quote, "In order to shorten the war and reap the fruits of any success, we must use the mobility of the cavalry." As noted earlier, the reality of World War I would show an utter futility of using horse and cavalry. Okay, so do you guys want to talk about the cavalry real quick? Okay, when you hear the word cavalry, what you should hear is the charge. The cavalry is the shock troop of its time. It's like with the kill box theory, you always want to be on higher ground. This is what Anakin Skywalker failed to realize when he was turning into Darth Vader. And Obi-Wan Kenobi was like, "It's over, Anakin. I have the higher ground." If you would have listened, Obi-Wan Kenobi couldn't have somersaulted above his head and cut off 3 of his limbs, which seemed even really ridiculous at the time. However, you want to be higher. Also, the gigantic amount of horse between you and the ground is a great way for you not to get any of your, vital organs pierced. This horse takes up a lot of target area. There's a place, there is a time and a place for horse cavalry. When you introduce machine guns to the equation, that time and that place dwindles. The advent of the machine gun literally negates any mobility that the horse has. The horse is not armored. The horse can be frightened. And on top of that, it could fall on you. Like it actually makes the horse become a liability in fighting like this. Now you still want to ride it around to yell at your troops and you want to smack its ass and all this other kind of stuff. That's fine, but it has no place on the battlefield once these tactical machine guns are introduced onto the battlefield. And it's surprising that Haig understands the importance of machine guns and tanks. We'll see. He understands the importance of machine guns and tanks, but he's committed. He's committed to the horses because he's been a cavalryman for so long. He was in India. He was a staff officer in India before he was commander of the British Expeditionary Forces. He's like, really what he should have been like is like, we need some of these tigers. We can get them wet and throw them over the trenches. That would have been what I said. I actually wrote a comic once about these special weapons where they would drench these cats and basically put them in catapults. Wet cats they're vicious. They're vicious, bro. That's all that I'm saying. On May 9, 1915, Haig commanded the First Army and it attacked Festubert, and he noted that the defense on our front are so carefully and so strongly made that the mutual support with the machine gun is so complete that in order to demolish them, a long methodical bombardment will be necessary by heavy artillery, guns, and howitzers before infantry are sent forward to attack. So this major, when he's writing this report, what he's trying to do is he's trying to give you an insight of where they're getting all of these tactics. The comment tends to predict his use of artillery against the strong German defenses in the Somme of 1916. While he may have misread the importance of horse cavalry, it's interesting to note that he recognized the value of machine guns very early. And in fact, 1898, Captain Haig commanded that he, quote, felt the want of machine guns in an encounter in Egypt. So that's interesting. All right, so here we go. We're lined up. We have all the pieces in place, and now we're going to actually talk about the battle. July 1st, 1916, 7:07. I had to get back into my army days. 0700. The artillery hits at its peak at 0720. The mine at the German strongpoint of the Hawthorne redoubt is blown. These are the combat engineers, son. The mine is blown. British troops rush forward to take the crater. So the idea is like this mine gets blown, and these guys all are rushing up to take the land that was just disrupted by this gigantic heavy explosive. All right, 7:28 in the morning. Other mines are detonated under German strong points. 7:30 a.m. artillery shifts fire to the German second line. Okay, so I mentioned that we were going to talk a lot about communications, and I already kind of talked about these phone lines and stuff. So, people, I mean, rightly so. I'm not saying that they're wrong, but people say, like, this is the first modern war. World War I was the first modern war. And that's true as far as guns are concerned. I'm sure it's true, these historians and stuff know, they can qualify and academize and debate all this stuff way more than I can. But you have to also keep into perspective, like how I started off the show, is like just a few decades before this, they were still lining up with funny colored jackets, shooting muskets at each other, 30 feet away, playing the drums and waving their flags around. So as far as like technology is concerned, these machine guns are bringing it to the modern era, but technology as far as communications are concerned are not there. There is a lack of communication that leads to this timed method of moving the artillery forward. So they set this timetable, and they're like, so let's see. The first half an hour, so they bombed the shit out of this place for a full week before this offensive started. I should say before the ground offensive started. Then they stopped, and the British and the French got up, and they started charging through no man's land. And at 7:30, so half an hour later, the artillery pieces dialed up to the second line defense, and they started hammering that. So there are no reliable radios. The landlines can be cut. They were actually at one point in time using smoke signals, flags, light signals. So as far as this communication is concerned, if the infantry gets held up and they need air support, they're stuck because this artillery, they need artillery support. If they get stuck and they need artillery support, they're shit out of luck. There's no way for them to communicate back to their lines to send a fucking smoke signal or a carrier pigeon out to the artillerymen that... Jesus. I guess I'm being animated. I guess I was very animated. All right, so there's no way that they could send a carrier pigeon or a smoke signal out to the artillery people, because the artillery people, the way they did this, the way it was planned out was it's going to take them a half an hour to get from the English line on the Western Front to the first German line. So they give them that half an hour, and then they start bombing the second German line. And then eventually the plan is to move to the third, to start bombing the third, or artillerying to shelling the third German line, so the English can move up to the second German line. You see what I'm saying? So if they get held up, they're just going to get left behind as far as this artillery support is concerned. 7:30 a.m. British troops move, and the French troops move forward to the first German line. I'm going to flip back to this report real quick. 7:30 hours on 1 July 1916, the heavily laden men of the British Expeditionary Force climbed out of their trenches and walked into no man's land. This is the you know, this is the fallacy of that Wonder Woman movie, where it's like, oh, it's called No Man's Land? Well, I'm a woman. I can cross no man's land. I mean, the part was really powerful in the movie, but look at, these are real fucking dudes that really fucking did this. These are real men that really fucking climbed out of these trenches and started assaulting the Germans across no man's land. There's nothing but mud and blood and shit and bullets and barbed wire flying at you, and fucking men did this. 7:30 hours on 1 July 1916, the heavily laden men of the British Expeditionary Force climbed out of their trenches and walked into no man's land. They moved forward in human waves. The Germans' reaction was swift and deadly. Their machine gunners had a field day. Their artillery centered on no man's land. The Germans at most points in the line were very confident. Private L. Ramage of the Glasgow Boys Brigade Battalion said, "As I approached the German trenches, I could see a wall of German soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder right along with the parapet on the front line trench, waving to us to come on." I mean, that's some powerful shit. Come on, little Englishmen. And they did. They fucking came. They climbed out of that shit and they jumped into that fucking mud, and they fucking trudged into certain death, the pinchers of the wolf. The Germans break their cover from their bombardments and start setting up their machine guns. So the Brits were hauling ass to close this ground. So, okay, I should say right here what that's all about is there's like a battlefield myth or whatever that the English all stood up at once and like walked calmly across. But what we're saying is that they were actually hauling ass to close the ground. So I'm going to talk a second about barbed wire and barbed wire problems. I mentioned before that barbed wire was a counter mobility obstacle, and it's actually classified as for counter mobility for a tank, which is weird because you think a tank could just roll over barbed wire, but the idea is like with a concertina wire on the barbed wire that you can wrap it around the road wheels and stop or slow down a tank. But definitely right here, before tanks are introduced into this battle, we have it as a way to corral human beings. So because of the artillery coming down didn't cut all of the barbed wire, what these dudes were doing as they were hauling ass across this no man's land is they were bunching up to where the holes in the wire were. And as they would bunch up, these German machine guns would just open up. They would just open up. They blasted these fucking Brits by the hundreds. Some of the units break into the German lines, gaining toeholds into those German lines. And on the day, because of the commo issues, it actually takes the commanders days to figure out which attacks worked and which didn't. They didn't have an actual picture of what was going on and who was holding what line across this massive Western front for days. Around the town of Montauban, down south, we have a better picture. A lot of the first day land objectives were taken, as well as 2,500 German prisoners. Further south, across the Somme River, and remember, this is where the French were, the French take all of their land objectives and another 3,000 German troops prisoner. The reason they were ready, because remember when I was doing the reading earlier, they were talking about their their artillerymen were a little bit more experienced. Their guns were bigger. And then we talked about how up north, a third of the artillery didn't even explode to cut the wires or whatever. So the French had better wire cutting bombs. When the smoke cleared, the Germans lost 12,000 men. The French lost 7,000 men, and the Brits had 57,000 casualties and 1,900 dead out of the 57,000. The battle stretches on until November. Hold on, I gotta find something else to read here. Back to the report. The battle continued. Falcaen, the German commander, ordered counterattacks to retake every yard of trench that was lost. He also began shifting reinforcements from the Verdun front. As mentioned earlier, 13 July saw the last large-scale use of horse cavalry in the Western Front. September 15th saw the first use of tanks. So what we're talking about is, this thing stretches until November. Well, I lost my fucking place. September 15th saw the first use of tanks. About 47 tanks were brought forward, but most historians say less than a dozen actually got into battle. The British gained ground, sometimes because of the tank and sometimes without it. No breakthrough was achieved. It began to rain in earnest in September, and since there were virtually no trees or even grasses left for miles, the mud became a serious problem. It got worse in October and November. Clay in the soil caused the mud to ball on the soles of boots to the size of a football. Remember, this is, I think, a British football, so like a soccer ball, I guess. Who understands soccer? Wounded, often drowned, rifles and Lewis guns became clogged with mud, and most of the fighting was hand to hand. I just need to repeat this. Rifles and Lewis guns became clogged with mud, and most of the fighting was hand to fucking hand. You know what that means? Fucking hand-to-hand combat with a bunch of Germans. Oh, I've seen this movie. Trench foot was rampant. Men in one unit were in mud up to their armpits. Those who found them could not get them out. Horses and mules got so bogged down that they had to be shot. The attack stopped in mid-November. In 4.5 months, they advanced about 8 miles. So the Allies advanced a mere 8 miles in 4 months of the battle. At the end, 450,000 German casualties, 200,000 French casualties, and 430,000 British casualties were had. Back to this report, though. While the Battle of the Somme dragged on, the Germans began constructing... you want to know how it ends? This is how it ends. While the Battle of the Somme dragged on, the Germans began constructing a new defensive system several miles behind the front lines. Work continued all through the winter, and in February 1917, the Germans withdrew to this new line. By doing this, they gave up nearly 1,000 square miles of territory. It was 10 times more than the Allies had captured in 1916. While the British and French troops reached this new line, they found a defensive system as strong as the one they so painfully forced the previous year. So that's how it ended. I mean, it ended, and a lot of people talk shit on the British for ending it that way, or for it being ended that way, and just taking so many casualties. But hold on. Before I get to this end part, we're going to do this. Hold on, I got to write it down. Do. All right. Oh, wait.
Stigmata Studios presents The Scorpion Strikes. In this comic book, a terrorist called the Scorpion is transported to a secret CIA prison. He quickly turns the tables on the guards and administrators and releases the prisoners. A well-armed anarchist called Constituent Zero assembles a team and fights to take the prison back. This story is a dark political action thriller. The Scorpion's actions set the stage perfectly for the Jin Jihad. Available on Indie Planet. Get more info on The Scorpion Strikes, the Jin Jihad, and other titles at stigmatastudios.com. Stigmata Studios presents The Test of the Scorpion. In this comic book, while the Jin Jihad is raging on one side of the city, the terrorist called the Scorpion sets a secondary attack in motion as he obtains a small tactical nuclear bomb. A mysterious, ever-living warrior called Cyrus the Dead Guy steps forward to test the faith of the Scorpion and his lunatic followers. This is an action-adventure story. It's a bit of swashbuckler that wraps up the Jihad stories. Available on Indie Planet. Get more info on The Scorpion Strikes, the Jin Jihad, The Test of the Scorpion, and other titles at stigmatastudios.com.
Yeah, don't forget to check out the Facebook page, Stigmata Studios, all one word. I'm actually popping in there the transcripts of some shows. Eventually, they're all going to be there. I have a handful there now. It's part of an experiment or whatever. Okay, check out the website, stigmatastudios.com. Check out the website, abercast.com. And check out the Patreon page. It's Patreon/Abercast, I think. Just go to the Abercast website and look at the bottom. There's a link to the Patreon. We're trying to get this Books for Soldiers thing lined up. It's fucking Memorial Day. Let's do this thing for these soldiers. All right. So despite the number of dead and wounded to the men who fought at the Somme, it was seen as a successful battle. They had saved their French ally, who went on to defeat the Germans at Verdun, and it had been a part of Haig's fourth phase of the victory, a quote wearing out fight of varying duration. So that's how we're going to kind of end this episode. And I'm wondering, like, what you guys think of this battle. You know, it's like you hear, like, here in America, it's like, you know, I'm not going to say that they don't, but it's just like we have sort of got away from this idea of a war of attrition. We don't want to have anything to do with attrition. We want to kill more dudes than you kill, and that's the end of it. So what do you think about this, you know, 1916 strategy to, you're just going to throw as much meat as the front as you can to wear your enemy down? It's cold-blooded. Was it right? I mean, what if after the first day they withdrew and didn't do anything? What would have happened? It's an interesting kind of thing to think about. You know, this cheapness of life, I guess. But I do know that the men that did fight there were proud of what they did because they feel like they freed the French up to actually end the war in Verdun. So I'm interested in what you have to say about that. You know, I mean, I guess if you're a millennial, you can weigh in, I suppose. But I feel like your generation's lost. So I'm not sure. But I do wonder how you think about it. I think these men were heroic. I think these men were like, we're going to do what needs to get done. You know, and this is the lot that was the lot that was dealt us is in there. Haig didn't want to fight so early. He actually wanted to get more tanks, and he wanted to get his troops more experience before he did it. But remember what the king or that General Joffrey said is, if we wait that long, if we wait till August, there will be no French army. We've got to do this now. And it reminds me of that final battle from Return of the King, where Aragorn's like, we're going to do this to draw attention away from whatever Frodo and that scam dude was doing, climbing these rocks or whatever. We're going to give this army something to look at. And it's different. It's weird. I didn't really put it together right now, but Tolkien served at the Battle of the Somme, and his seeming aversion to this industrial revolution might have actually came from these machine guns and these weapons of war and these artillery shells blasting these trees apart and stuff. Like, looking now, I could see that stuff in the imagery of those stories and those movies and everything. I think it might be an interesting way to look into this story. However, the way we're looking into this story is just from a Memorial Day. It was a Memorial Day story, and in my notes I was going to open it with reading the fucking poems about the poppies and all this other shit, but who wants to fucking hear that? Literally, who wants to hear it? Give me mud up to your armpits and shit and fucking horse blood and machine guns. That's what we want to hear. Because we read the old tomes. I am John Towers. This has been the Abercast. Happy Memorial Day, everybody. If you stuck with me this far, I want to wish you all a happy Memorial Day. Take a second to pour a drink out for our homies. And remember, Memorial Day is not Veterans Day. Veterans Day is right around the corner. Don't tell a veteran Happy Memorial Day. You know, to them, to us, to everybody, it should be remembering the war dead of our country and of all countries, of the British Expeditionary Force here, the men that laid their limbs and their fucking eyes and their fucking teeth and their jawbones and their skin and their lives down to defeat the Germans at the Battle at the Somme. It's not about veterans, it's about the dead. So take a second to do that, please. Just take a second to do that, and then crack open your beers, pour out into your soon-to-be Abercast mason jars in your gin jihads. Think about the war dead for a minute and pour your drinks out. And then fucking grill and have fun with your family and your fucking friends. And think about why you could do that. I'm getting touched. I gotta... Right now, I'm starting Memorial Day weekend early. I'm going to go cook steaks and shrimp on the grill right now. Before I go, God, I can't believe I'm getting emotional. Okay, here we go. This is Soda Jerk. Fuck a fight. No, I said fuck a fight. What's going on? All right, here we go. It's going to work now.
Well, I was just 14 when I had my first sip. In my darling whiskey, she tightened up her grip. And she made me sick that night. I knew that the whiskey would take up my life. Well, I stand a full 2 inches below 5'9". And every guy here wants to take me alive. So I took a shot of whiskey and punch out their lights. The whiskey, it makes me wanna fucking fight. I fucking fight, fucking fight. The whiskey, it makes me wanna fucking fight. Place. Not even the crack of dawn is safe. So I took a shot of whiskey and say goodnight. The whiskey, it makes me wanna fucking fight. I fucking fight, fucking fight. The whiskey, it makes me wanna fucking fight. The whiskey, it makes me wanna fucking fight. The whiskey, it makes me wanna fucking fight. Yeah.
Sorry for getting emotional earlier. I don't know what the fuck.